have to discipline myself to kind of stay still as much as possible. Y'all already know I lost that battle. I'm going to be moving around, but I'll try and stay still for the audio. All right, so some water just dropped on me from somewhere. Anyone know what that is? All right. Hope it's not a bird. Hope it's just condensation. I didn't, okay, I guess am I just telling you when to click the slides? I didn't get a clicker. Just say, yeah, click or move. I can't actually see up there, so that's all right. All right, so I just heard that this is a solid food series. I didn't even know that that's what this was, that this is a solid food class. What this has been, this is not actually the solid food class. This is more like a good nutrition class. Like what I'm teaching you is, thank you. What I'm teaching y'all is, proper meal planning. How to eat right, chew slowly, take a smaller bite, don't stuff your mouth, chew it slowly and savor the flavor. Breathe in and get the sense of the food before you eat it. Take a look at all the different colors, know what you're eating, and enjoy the whole thing while you're eating it. That's what I'm teaching you about the Bible. Does that make sense? What you do with what I teach you, that's the solid food. The Bible is the solid food. And I'm just helping you, equip you to get deeper into it and to understand what you're reading better than before. So we just gave an introduction, the first class, about all different kinds of ways to read the Bible and how to look at the Bible and how to think about the Bible, general principles of interpreting when you read. And then we looked at various ways of reading the Bible, reading real close and deep and focusing on, just a couple verses, or taking a step back and, reading a passage, just kind of thinking and applying it in different ways, or reading entire books, or reading through entire types of books or series of books in the Bible, and then spiritual reading, focusing on a passage and chewing it, meditating on it, digesting it, letting it fill your soul, and letting it nourish your being. So those different types of reading, we talked about that. We talked about different genres of biblical literature, the different kinds of writing that are in the Bible. What are some of the different kinds of writing that are in the Bible that we talked about? Okay, poetry, narrative, parables, biography, and what? What is it? What do you say? I can't. Prophecy. Okay, I just couldn't hear you. Sorry. Yeah, I just couldn't hear you. Yeah, prophecy. So we talked about those different things. And then the last time I was here, we focused in and talked in more detail about narrative, about prophecy, and about poetry and songs kind of thing. So let me ask you, what was the big... What do I need to do? Oh, I'm not in front of the mic. See? I told you I'd do that. Let me take this bad boy out because I can't do it. Okay, so I talk with my hands. Actually, that's not true. I talk with my whole body. And also, I think I shared with you guys, I have ADHD. And so part of that means that I'm emotion. Now, oddly, I don't have the hyperactive kind, although my wife argues with me about that. But I was diagnosed. I have the inattentive type, so I have trouble paying attention. But unless I like it, because you guys are, well, how you know all that stuff about the Bible? How you know them names, the dates, and stuff? How come you can tell me what verse? Because I read it and I like it. Because this is if you have ADHD, the people with ADHD have this weird thing called hyperfocus. If they like it, then they can sit there for 20 hours just doing that whatever it is that they like. And I happen to like reading. Also weird for ADHD. A lot of times people with ADHD have trouble reading. Why? Because they're not paying attention, right? It's hard to pay. Well, what was that in the last sentence? I don't remember. What's this paragraph about again? What am I reading? Well, book squirrel. So it's kind of like that. But it doesn't work that way for me. For me, for whatever reason, it's almost the opposite. Because if you give me something to read, then I'm interested. Well, what is it? What are you trying to tell me? What's this about? What is that? Whose phone that? Turn that off. Turn that off. All right. You don't want me to go all Tyler Perry on you now. For those of you who don't know, Tyler Perry, the actor, producer, writer, star, blah, 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 film productions, owns the largest film studio in the world and over in Atlanta. That's where Marvel films all their films now. But he used to do what was called the Chitlin circuit, and he would produce his own plays, and then he would perform these plays all throughout the South, including here in Columbia. And why was I mentioning Tyler Perry? Oh, if ADHD, see? But if you came late to one of his plays, in the middle of the play, and he was probably going to be Medea, right? It's this famous character. In the middle of the play, Medea would be just turned to you. I see you over there. Don't be coming in late now. Don't be coming in late. Yeah, you in the jacket with the tie, wearing the blue shirt. And he'll call you out and go off on you in front of the whole audience. So don't make me Tyler Perry you. All right. Anyway, first slide. Let me shut up and get into it. You're like, oh, yeah. So last time we talked about narrative. I have the clicker. That's why nothing's happening. Okay. We talked about narrative, prophecy, and poetry. What's the main difference? This is kind of a quiz. What's the main difference between narrative and poetry? If I'm telling you a story or I'm sharing a poem or a song, what's the main difference? Why would I choose one over the other? I'm talking about in the Bible. Like, pretend you're God. Why would you choose one or the other? Sometimes he does both. And I mentioned several instances where he does both. What are you getting from a poem that you're not getting from a story? And what are you getting from a story that you may or may not get from a poem? Okay, mnemonic. You're getting memory. You get better memory with a poem or a song, right? Fill in the blank. Humpty Dumpty. You learned that when you were like 2, and you still remember it, right? That's the power of poetry. That's the power of poetry. And you remember the next line, not because you remember it, because it rhymes with wall. So Humpty Dumpty had a great, and you're not searching through your memory banks. Your eyes aren't rolling up in your head. You're not trying to, it's just there. It's just automatically there. That comes because it's poetry and also from repetition, from over and over and over again, and it sinks in. And so the ancient writers, they've designed their things that way. I don't know if I mentioned, probably I did in the first class, the Bible was written and meant, it's oral literature. The Bible is primarily meant to be heard. So you should read it out loud. You're supposed to tell it to your children. You're supposed to recite it. You're supposed to speak to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. The Bible's meant to be talked, to be said, to be sung, to be recited. That's what the Bible is. It's written that way. It's supposed to be. And part of it is that you get different cadence. Remember, I even said that sometimes it's hard to even tell the difference between poetry and narrative sometimes, like in the prophets, because a lot of it's so poetic and so rich. The language is just doing things that normally poetry does. In Genesis, the reason that Genesis is such a powerful book is because those stories have a whole lot going on beneath the surface. They're deep psychologically. They're entertaining as stories. They are informative. They are real. They are gut real. And so we react. We relate to them. We're attracted to them. And we want to know what happened. But there's all kinds of stuff going on beneath the surface. I mean, take a story like Joseph, right? The Joseph cycle, where Joseph is Jacob's favorite son. Why? Because what? He was born in his old age. And why else? His favorite wife. He was Rachel's biological son. His other sons by Rachel weren't by Rachel, right? They're from her slave woman. So Joseph was the one that came from Rachel. So it was the favorite son born in his old age from his favorite wife. Now think about this story. How messed up is this whole story? What if you Leah, right? It's from the get-go, wedding night, next morning. Oh, I got the wrong one. I don't want you. I don't want you. I love her. This actually happened. How is she supposed to feel? This is real. And then he works 7 years for Rachel. Again, after he'd already worked 7 years for her, he works another 7 years for her, to marry the woman he actually loves. So this whole time, Rachel and Leah, and they're sisters. Even worse. It gets uglier. And then they have problems, with having kids, stuff like that. Now they're giving up their slave woman. I'll have sex with my slave woman, and they'll give you a child. Blah, blah, blah. So now you got all 13 kids, 12 boys and a girl. Between the 4 women, this is a jacked up family. And then meanwhile, he tells us the Joseph story starts out by saying, then daddy comes and says, hey, everybody gather around. Look at this awesome coat I got from my favorite son, Joseph. Y'all ain't getting one, just him. That's how it starts. So it's going downhill from there. And then it goes on, Joseph, of course, is not too bright there because Joseph, I had a dream that all y'all was bound down to me. Okay, even if God gives you that dream, you don't got to make it public because you asking for trouble. So anyway, these stories are complicated. They're deep. They're entertaining. They're psychologically accurate and real. They speak to us, and we see ourselves in them. And so there's power there. The poetry, some of the most beautiful love poetry ever written is in the Bible. Song of Psalms. Many of the Psalms love poetry to God. But also some of the most violent, angry expressions of vengeance, of hatred, of I'm going to get you back, or if you're the enemy, are in the Psalms as well. And stories like that in the Bible. Some of the most horrific things. And you're like, well, why is that all in the Bible? You tell me, why is all that in the Bible? Why is it in the Bible? Why is there such horrific stuff in the Bible? Because what? It's a story of man. That's how we are. So why should we not expect to find it in there? Why do you think all that stuff is on TV? Because that's who we are. That's who we are as people. And so it's in the Bible because that's who we are. God's not sugarcoating it because that's just y'all. This is why you need me. And that's not how I made you. When I made you, and I looked at your old dusty butt, just freshly made, right out the ground, I said, whoo, that's good. That's good. And when I took half of you, ripped off your side, and made the first woman, I said, man, I looked at both of y'all and said, that's very good. That's really good. Y'all the best thing I ever made. A few days later, no, I don't know how long it was, but. So today we're going to be talking more about the New Testament. A lot of that was Old Testament, but there were some things in the New Testament. But we're going to be focusing more on the New Testament this time. And so the genres we'll be looking at are Gospels. I'm throwing Acts in there. It's kind of tags along with Luke. Letters and apocalyptic literature. If we have more time, I do a whole separate, all by itself class just on the Gospel of John because it deserves it. But we don't have time, so y'all ain't going to get that. All right, so First, reading the Gospels. What are Gospels? Well, Gospels are lives of Jesus. And you say, well, lives of Jesus. Yeah, of course, it's about Jesus' life. But I mean this in a technical sense. In the Greco-Roman world, in the first century, in that time period, there was actually a genre of literature called a life, Greek bios. Okay, bios, biology, right? The study of life. So bios is a life. And this is a type of literature, famous lives of people. And you basically write about some famous person, and it would talk about different things that the person did, that this is why they're great, Caesar is great because, he built that for us, and he beat those people, and he made that, and, he brought peace. So Caesar's awesome, isn't he? But it also would have different ways that you were supposed to know that he was great. Well, when he was born, there was a 3-headed cow that walked past a goat, and the goat dropped dead, and the cow gave pink milk. So, see, Caesar's awesome because all that happened, that happened in front of his house the day he was born. And so there's some omen or things like that. And then there's also different interactions, examples from the person's life that show you, again, why this person's great. When he encountered this person, he said this, oh, that was wise. Or he did this, oh, that was really. So these are known as lives. You can still read them today. Some of you have had to read them in school. So there's a famous set, two Roman writers, one Suetonius and the other Tacitus, both wrote Lives of the Caesars. And so if you ever watch any Caesar thing on TV, that's usually drawn from those guys. And so Gospels are like that in terms of the type of literature, but they're about Jesus. And typically these are historical works, right? Because they're talking about actual things that people said and did, and they're usually living witnesses when these things are being published. So Caesar didn't say that. I was there that day. That's not what he said. So similarly with Jesus, there were plenty of people alive at the time the Gospels were being published. Gospels, in this case, Gospels contain lots of different types of materials, but they contain stories about Jesus, stories about the life of Jesus. They're multidimensional. And when I say they're multidimensional, I mean both any individual gospel, but also the fact that we have 4 of them. Why do we have 4 gospels, especially since 3 of them basically tell you pretty much the same thing? Of course, there's a whole lot in that pretty much, because they're not the same. Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. They're composed from multiple sources. What are some of the sources that you can think of that are in a gospel? Pardon? First person sources. So, someone, I seen it, and it's a report. What else? Okay, anyone have a Bible? Open your Bible to the Gospel of Luke. Yes. So other compilations of stories that are circulating, floating around, some written, some just remembered, stories people are telling. Yeah, did you hear about? And some of those get written down, some of those just stay, did you hear about? But if you hear about it, then you can write it down and include it in the gospel. Okay? At beginning Luke, how does Luke start? How does Luke start? Somebody just read it out loud. Big voice. Stand out, big voice.
Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught.
Okay, so that's how Luke starts. That's how Luke starts his Gospels. All of them are similar, but the reason I picked Luke there is because Luke tells us exactly what his sources are, and he tells us to whom he's writing, for whom he's writing, Theophilus. He's writing the book, and he tells us why he's writing it, so that Theophilus will be certain of the information that's being conveyed in there, that he'll know that it's, that he can be certain. He'll have an accurate accounting of the life of Jesus. And so those sources that Luke talks about, he says eyewitnesses. He says other writings that other people wrote. He says he did careful investigation and research. And then he thought through why he was writing it, and he composed an orderly account. What does that imply? I composed an orderly account. What is necessary to compose an orderly account? Okay, facts. That helps. What else? Pardon? Peer review. Notice, he said, I'm going back, I'm not making this up. Luke said it. He said, many others have already written stuff. He said, I talked to eyewitnesses, and he said he's relying on both verbal and written accounts. And so there's built-in peer review for this. Because if he's relying on other sources, and that person comes up, or somebody that's read one of those stories said, well, that's not what they said, and that's not how they said it, that's not exactly what that meant, right? It's peer review built in. Okay, what else? I forgot the question I just asked you before that. Yes? A what? Chronology. And this and Luke, so chronology is just the sequence and timing of things and keeping that in mind. Now, Luke is a little bit different than the others in that Luke has a little bit better chronology, and he gives you more dates, for things. During the reign, in the third year of the reign of Quirinius, who was governor of when Cyrus, he's giving you very specific information. But all four of them, including Luke, right, none of them really give you the kind of chronology that we modern readers expect. None of them. None of the four say, in 1973, on March 1st, this 2 weeks later, blah, blah. They don't do that. They're like, well, Jesus was walking and doing some stuff. Now then he came up, that now then might be a year later. They don't tell you that. It's hard to even tell. Luke, and I said Luke does this too. Luke does this in Acts, right? Oh, so the church is starting, the church is growing, everything's coming up, and then it says, now there was disturbance, and the whole church got scattered. That was years after the sentence before. When Paul gets converted, that's like about the church has been around for about 10 years before Paul gets converted. You don't think that when you're reading it. You're like, well, here's the person, okay, Stephen, so that's like, okay, the church just started last week, and now Stephen's there, and then Paul's over there, taking people's robes. Because he writes in such a way to make you feel like that. But if you pay attention, or if you know any cross-references or any other dates, which we have some, you know that that's not what's going on. Years or months, big spans of time are passing. Also, you kind of have to do that. Otherwise, it starts to feel like Lord of the Rings. Right? If he really wrote about everything that happened when Paul was journeying from such and such to such and such, sometimes the journey itself took a year. And you're going land and boat, and there's bandits and the things. Paul gives you clues. Sometimes they tell you, like he was in a shipwreck, one of the best written shipwreck accounts of all history. But in I think it's 2 Corinthians, he's talking about all the stuff that he went through. You don't read about a lot of that in Acts. You're like, and he's talking about, I got beaten and bandits and animals and wild stuff coming up after me in the wind and the rain, all kinds of stuff. He can't tell you all of that. You wouldn't even want to read it. Like I said, it'll be like, I'm glad I read Lord of the Rings when I was a kid. I liked it a lot. But thinking back to it, it would have like 70 pages of them just walking through some forest. So I was like, all right. It's not like the movies. Okay, so it's composed from multiple sources, eyewitness accounts. Why is that important that they're eyewitness accounts? Why is that important for us? Why do we care that there were eyewitness accounts? Validity, it is hearsay, but it is hearsay in a way, right? Because but you're hearing it from somebody who was there. It's not, legal hearsay. Hearsay where I heard my second cousin Mildred, her plumber told me that his son, when he was at school, his teacher said that his aunt told him that, you weren't going to be there. So that's why I wasn't expecting you. So it's not like that. It's nothing like that. And then the Gospels are evangelistic. The word evangelism comes from the word for gospel. Evangelion means good proclamation or good news. And typically, in the first century, that was a proclamation that a new Caesar was taking reign, or that Caesar had conquered some country, or that he was going to come and build a building in your city, whatever, those kinds of good news. Okay, they're similar but different. And so they're kind of had different audiences or different places where they circulated. Matthew in Syria, and Mark in Rome, Luke, not clear with Luke, and then John in Ephesus. And these are places where the authors or people that they were close to were kind of well known. John actually died in Ephesus. And then they were written for different audiences. So Matthew, primarily a Jewish audience. Mark, for more of a Roman audience. Similar with Luke. And Luke tells you that he was writing it for, if it's a real person, Theophilus, or it might be a generic name, because Theophilus means lover of God. So it might be, like, dear reader. I just wanted to let you know, Theophilus might be like that, because Theophilus might be like, hey, new person studying the Bible. I just wanted to make sure that you had all the facts about Jesus. So kind of like that, not clear. It looks like it's a real person, though, from the other things he says in Acts as well. It's true. And then John's written for everyone. Why is John written? That you may believe. How you know that? Because he says it. No, but these things, going back to the very first class, those kinds of things are really, really important. You want to pay attention. If the author is telling you, this is how I wrote this, or this is who I wrote it to, or this is why I wrote it, this is all real important. And so the fact that John wrote so that we would believe, that explains a lot of why John is writing the way that he's writing, and why he's telling you the things that he's telling you. And in John, this is why John calls the miracles, and John doesn't call them miracles. He calls them what? Signs. Why? Because they point to who Jesus really is, and I'm writing this so that you will believe that he is who he says he is. Does that make sense? Miracle, something different. Miracle, oh, wonder, a miracle, whoo, okay, must be an awesome person. A sign, wait, is there something I'm missing? Who is this guy? That's what John wants. Who is this guy? And he's trying to make you see the answer. He's God. Okay, and then forget the how. It's up there, but I'm not going to go into it. And then the whys, I'm not going to go into that either. Okay. This is more for the sake of time, that's why. So when you're reading the Gospels, take time to appreciate the distinctiveness of each Gospel and don't really focus on harmonizing the Gospel. What do I mean when I say harmonizing them? What is that? Yeah, make them all fit together. If they were meant to all fit together, there'd only been one. Serious. There'd only been one. The fact that there are four means that there's a reason for there to be four. So they're distinctive. There is something different about each of the four, and you're supposed to pick up on that and get something out of that. It might be as simple as it's speaking to four different, audiences and different types of people, but I think it's a little bit deeper than that. So don't try and rush to harmonize it. Okay? Now, you can, and it's helpful to still try and understand or figure out what's going on. Hey, how come it said one blind dude here and over here it said two blind dudes? It seemed like the same story. What's going on? I don't understand. Okay? And this is our modern mind, right? We spend a whole lot of time agonizing, okay, the whole Bible, I'm throwing it out. I don't believe in God anymore because of them two blind men. Instead of, what's the point? What was the point of the story, right? What was he saying in the first place? What about the men, whether it's a man or two men? What about them? And that, when you think about it, that's even deeper. Because when you look at it in those things, right, the blind people see. And the sighted people, especially the Pharisees and Sadducees, are blind to who Jesus is. But the blind people clearly see who Jesus is. That's what you're supposed to get out of it. Now, if you get that out of it, does it matter if it's one or two? Yeah, but which one was it? I don't know. I don't know.
Sorry, could you say that again? Sorry.
I don't know, Siri. Okay. When you're reading, also kind of try and stay aware of the life setting of both Jesus and the author in a particular passage. So ask yourself the question, why does the author want us to know this about Jesus? And this goes back to the first class. You got to pay attention to the whole context now. So what came before? What came after? And how does this fit in? If you're reading like in the Synoptic Gospels, and you'll see that there's a story of something going on, and you're like, wait, that's not where it was in Mark. Why not? Why did Luke decide to put it here, same story, and not where Mark had it? Why did Mark have it there, and why did Luke have it here? Same exact story. Why? Well, the context explains that. Sometimes they're just grouping similar themes together. Sometimes they're showing you that there's a development of thought happening. Sometimes they're trying to highlight and emphasize a particular point, and so they'll put the story there because that story illustrates the point that Jesus later will just outright say. But if you're just kind of reading it, but you're supposed to be thinking about these things. And remember, this is oral. The earliest people were having this read to them. They weren't reading it. They were having it read to them. You just have to keep all this in your head and know this, which they were used to doing because they were used to hearing things that way. You have it better than they did because you can read it. You can go back and look. You can flip the page. You can read it again and again. So overall approach to reading the Gospels. Trying to determine the meaning for the original hearers of Jesus, then try and determine the meaning for the original, this is the same thing. Why is this here? And then try and also, I messed up on that slide. What I meant to write, that second one is, and then try and determine what it meant for the original readers or hearers of the gospel. I don't know if you caught that. What's the difference? Oh, none of y'all caught it, huh? The audience of Jesus versus the audience of the book. Do you understand that difference? This is really crucial, and it's a distinction that we're not used to making. When let's say John is writing and telling you that at the festival, at the Feast of Lights, Jesus stood up and he blah, 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 and he's talking and he said to them, I am the light of the world. Well, that's pretty awesome. What would that mean to the guy sitting there celebrating Hanukkah, looking up and some guy stands up and says that while they lighting the menorah, right? This is a question. What does it mean for his original hearers? And it's like, that's pretty awesome. Also, that guy's crazy. Also, what the heck is he talking about? Light? How? What do you mean I'm a light? What does that even mean, right? So these are all questions that the people hearing him would have. But that's not the same as, why did John put that there? What does John want you to understand? What does John want you to understand from Jesus saying that? Do you see why it's important to understand that distinction? What John wants you to see is not necessarily the same thing or equal to what Jesus wanted you to see. And you need to see both. Obviously, you need to know what Jesus meant and what he was talking about. But you also need to know what John was trying to point out, what John wanted you to see about what Jesus was saying. And they're not always the same thing. I'll give you a really good example, and you might talk about it in your next weeky thing. But John 6, Jesus talking, he feeds 5,000 people. Gives them bread and fish, right? 5,000 people. And then he goes off this big, long speech, and he says, well, just like my father fed your fathers, just like my dad fed your ancestors back in the day with bread from heaven. He's saying this, right? But he just done did it. He just fed them with bread. Then he goes on to say, yeah, but y'all understand, I'm the bread. I'm the bread of life. I came down from heaven to feed you. You live on me. Right? And y'all nodding, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. But then he goes on and says, look, I don't think you guys understand. Unless you gnaw on my flesh and you guzzle down my blood, you don't have life. And it would have sounded kind of like that when he said it to them, right? And what was their response? Yeah. No, that was his disciples. That's a hard teaching, Lord. That's a hard teaching. What was the response of the other people? They left. They got up and left. They stopped following him. They left. They turned around and walked away. Thousands of people walked away. And he had no problem driving off 1,000 people. They all got up, walked out that door, got in their cars, and drove away. And then he turns to his disciples and says, you guys want to leave too? Huh? And they gave the very encouraging response, we ain't got no place else to go. Might as well stay with you. But my question to you is, I don't want you to answer. I just want you to think. What was he talking about? What was he talking about when he said, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood? The first thing that's going to jump into your mind is what? Communion. He wasn't talking about that. Why not? Why not? Why could he not have been talking about communion? It hadn't happened yet. He had not created communion. There was no such thing as communion. Not a single person there, including his own disciples, would know from communion that it was meaningless. That there's no communion. There was no such thing as communion. So that's not what he was talking about. So now you have to ask, well, what was he talking about? What did Jesus expect those people to understand? I'll leave that as an exercise for you. But that's asking yourself about the original audience. However, John is believed to have been the latest written gospel for various reasons. And so, what would John's readers, what would they be thinking? What would John's readers be thinking? John's readers, they'd be thinking communion. So John might have wanted them to think about communion. Do you understand the difference? So it might be, John might have included it so that they would have a deeper appreciation of communion. But that's not what Jesus was really talking about. Does that make sense? And the danger is we are like John's readers. We immediately think communion, but that's not really what Jesus, and so we miss what Jesus was really talking about because we think we already know. He was talking about, I know that. He's talking about communion. End of story. But that's not what he's talking about. So what is he talking about? If you thought communion, then you don't know what Jesus was talking about. So that's why it's important. Okay, and then last, consider modern applications which are faithful to the original meanings. That's true of everything that I'm going to talk about tonight, everything. That's the last thing, is you consider the modern applications. So before you can start doing all the applying to what this means for me, what about now, what am I supposed to do with this, what about the church? Before you can do that, you have to understand what might this have meant in the first place. What did it mean back then? And with the Gospels, it's tricky. Like I said, because you have Jesus saying stuff, it means one thing, what he's saying to the people, and then you have the author telling you that Jesus said stuff, and the author's reason might not be Jesus' reason. And they're both true, and they're both going on at the same time with the same thing that you're reading. I told you it was deep. Okay. So just a quick review, each gospel paints a different picture. That's on purpose. Like I said, if it wasn't supposed to be that way, we'd only have one and not four. Understand that parables, I'm just throwing this in, parables usually have a single point. And then the goal of the Gospels, all four of them, is to get to know Jesus. It's for you to know Jesus, for you to begin to have a relationship with Jesus, for you to begin understanding Jesus, for you to begin following Jesus, for you to care about, for you to fall in love with Jesus. That's why all four of them were written, so that you would know and that you would want to have a relationship with Jesus, and you'd know with whom you were having a relationship. Okay? Now back to the parables. What does that mean that parables have a single point? It sounds real simple, right? What's the opposite of that, or alternative to that? Yeah, well, what we all tend to do, okay? You read a parable in the Bible talk, and you think it was 10 zillion points. Because y'all be talking for 2 hours about, Jesus said, love your neighbor. And 2 hours you're talking about it, the Good Samaritan and all that kind of stuff. The point of that parable is everyone's your neighbor. Don't have favorites. God don't have no favorites, neither should we. Care about each person. The one who's right with you, care about them. And the person you think is that really good person is not who you think it is. In Jesus' parable, the Samaritan was the good guy. That's not the good guy in their lives, right? Samaritan was the bad, hated guy, not the good guy. So single point in that one, it was, and how do I know that was the point of that parable? He did? Jesus told us. What did he say? Well, he said go and do likewise, but earlier, right, it actually says, remember there was a guy it's an answer to a question, exactly. And they tell you that. In the gospel, it tells you that. It's the answer to a question, and the question was basically, who's my neighbor? Right? I know I'm supposed to love my neighbor, but I don't really love this guy right now, so who's really my neighbor so I can wiggle out of that requirement to love my neighbor? We being Christian, we would never do that. But, back then they used to do things like that with the Bible. Okay, now Acts, and I'll be real quick with this one, and then we'll spend most of the time remaining time in letters, and the remaining time's not a lot, because I wasted it talking about ADHD. Sorry about that. Okay, so the Acts of the Apostles is basically a history of the birth and rapid growth of the church. It's apologetic in nature. Apologetic doesn't mean saying I'm sorry, but apologetic means it's a defense of the Christian faith because it was beginning to make waves, primarily because it was growing so fast in the Roman Empire. And it was kind of looked at askance by your average everyday Roman. They looked at it funny. There were several reasons for that. There were some positive things, some negative things, but a lot of the negative rumors and hearsay, there was all kinds of crazy stuff. Oh, I heard they were cannibals. They getting together every week and talking about eating someone's body and drinking their blood. They cannibals. And, a lot of these people, they're incestuous because they're always talking about loving their brothers and sisters. And they don't even believe in the gods. Can you believe that? They don't even believe in the gods. They're atheists. Think about that. Christians were thought of as atheists because they don't believe in Zeus. They don't believe in, Athena and all them, so they were thought of as atheists. They didn't worship the gods. On the other hand, they were the only ones who cared for children, and so there was a practice then of abandoning children, just leave them out and let the vultures eat them, or the wolves or whatever, and Christians would go looking for abandoned children, rescue them, and then, raise them. They started orphanages and they took care of kids like that. They were known for taking care of the sick. And one guy, governor, was writing to an emperor and say, how should I handle these Christians? I have trouble doing too much negative because they take better care of our sick than we do. So there were some positive things as well, but they got a lot of bad press. So Book of Acts focuses on the pivotal roles primarily of Peter and Paul among the apostles, And this was because of later things that had happened by the time that Acts was written. The church had tended to focus around Peter and Paul, and the other guys were in other, running around in other countries or dead. One of them died already, even in the book of Acts. Who was that? Nope, he wasn't an apostle. It was James, yes. James the apostle, not to be confused. He's John's brother, not to be confused with James, the brother of Jesus. Jesus had a brother named James too. It's really confusing because all of them had real common names. And so there's a James and John, brothers who are apostles. And then there's also, Jesus had brothers named James, John, Judah or Judas, and Simon. Okay, Jesus did. That were not the apostles. And now, well, how do you know all this? It tells you. It says that. And he has sisters. They didn't tell us their names. But he had probably around at least 4 sisters. There were definitely 2 or more, because it's sisters, plural, right? So there got to be more than one of them. And the way that it says it, and his sisters, the way that it's written seems to imply that it's more than 2. He had a bunch of brothers and sisters. So keep that in mind. When you're reading the book of Acts, the James who was the leader or president of the church in Acts 15, when they make that proclamation, and then James stood up among the brothers and said, blah, 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 and write this letter and send this out. That's not the apostle. That's Jesus' brother. And he was known as James the righteous one, James the just, James the righteous one, because he had a really good reputation among the Jews for being, a legalist, which we saw he kind of was. Okay, so it may have been prepared as a legal defense for Paul at his trial, which came up later, and it's a continuation of the Gospel of Luke. It makes that really clear. That's basically what the book of Acts is. Any other thoughts or ideas on what's in Acts or what you get out of it, why it's good? I'm going to give you some. Okay, so when you're reading Acts, the key to the plot, the chronology, the setting, the headings of the book of Acts is Acts chapter 1, verse 8, where Jesus says to them that first, throughout Jerusalem and all Judea, they ask him, when's this going to come? When's the Spirit? He said, I told y'all before, I don't really know when it's going to happen. I don't know when all that's going to happen. Only my Father knows. I told you that before. Didn't you read the previous book? You just jumping in the sequel. But anyway, he said he told them that already, and that he says, but you'll know because Holy Spirit's going to do some things, and then the word, you will spread the news about me throughout Jerusalem and all Judea, through Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth. And when you read Acts, what are you reading? You read about the birth and growth of the church in Jerusalem, and then in the surrounding Judea, and then in Samaria, Philip converts to Samaritans, and then Paul expanding out to the rest of the world. And of course, that's representative. It's not like Paul literally went everywhere in the world. Again, that's our modern brains thinking. This is a Jewish one. They're like, look, Jesus is telling them, you go first to God's chosen people, then to their leftover cousins in Samaria that y'all didn't like, but that God still likes because they're the remnants of Israel. Then y'all talk to everybody else. That's the plan, and that's also the plan and outline of the book of Acts. When you're reading Acts, it's not always a pattern for everything. In our restoration movement, Churches of Christ movement and everything, we've been kind of trained and conditioned to believe that the book of Acts is the blueprint for the church. It's a pattern for how, the church is supposed to be, and how. It's not what it is. It's a record of what happened. It's not a pattern. You good luck trying to find a pattern or go by a pattern in there. Okay, well, see, right here, it says that a church is led by elders. See, the elders in Ephesus came to him and everything. Yeah, but it also says the church was led by a bunch of prophets and teachers. The church in Antioch, Acts 11, right? where they were first called Christians, by the way, was led by prophets and teachers. Well, but those prophets and teachers must have been elders. And okay, well, that's not what it says. But so it's not a pattern. It's just what happened. Now, you can find some things that are good. You can see their examples. Say, okay, that seems like a good idea. That they had a group of elders leading the church. That's a good idea. And the church did stick with that historically. And, it's a good idea that you had evangelists going to different places, planting churches, and you had apostles and evangelists going to different places and starting churches. That's a great idea. Let's keep doing that, right? But it's not God saying, this is how you should do it. This is the only way you can do it. Don't do it any other way, or else, I don't know you. So it's not necessarily representative. Okay? How would you feel if some guy stood up right now, in the middle of the room and said, hey, Joey, just as I'm unbuttoning my shirt, you will be stripped and bound and hanging out in the jail next week. Well, that happens in the book of Acts. Okay? That's exactly what Agabus does, right? This belt, just as I'm tight the belt, just as I'm binding my belt, so will you be bound if you go to Jerusalem. And he goes and he gets bound. Anyway, it's just a record of what happened, just like most biblical narrative is, and we talked about that with the Old Testament as well. Any thoughts, fears, concerns, frightening feelings, me saying that? I'm sure there are. But I'm saying it's not a bad thing. It's not that you can't use the information. It's that the information is not binding. You can't say, well, you're wrong because you're doing it some way. Now, there might be good practical. You might say you're wrong for other reasons, other parts of the Bible. So, for example, so how long has this church been around? 23 years. Wow, your elders are really doing a good. Oh, we don't have any elders. How long? 23 years you don't have any elders? None? Have you ever had them? No. 23 years? Okay, well, there's something wrong there. Oh, wait, you guys are going, but most of the churches in our movement don't have any. Okay, anyway, there's something wrong. But not because they're in Acts, but because they're all throughout the Bible, and there's a reason. It's healthy. And they tell you why they're there. So that's why we should have them. Okay, New Testament letters, and this is the final one. No, it's not the final one. What's the final one? Apocalyptic. So that's the final one. So New Testament letters, they're just letters. They're letters. They're just regular, old, normal letters. Again, we don't have time. Ordinarily, I'd actually show you an example of a first century letter. It's pretty cool. Some kid asking for money. And they were just letters. And they had, the New Testament ones are Christianized letters. And so, a regular old first century Greco-Roman letter would start out with joy. That's just a greeting, right? Joy. I hope that you and your family are faring well. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It would start out joy. Joey, to Richard. I hope that your family is well, and may you be blessed upon, so some sort of nice encouraging and a blessing or some sort of thought. And then the reason I'm writing to you is that business transaction that we had still has not been consummated. The monies that we agreed upon have not arrived with my banker, and so I'm writing to ask about the timing of the arrival of such funds. May your health remain forever, and that's it. So that's like the standard, format of a letter. And so that structure doesn't sound weird because it's pretty much how we still write letters today, right? Dear so-and-so, except we put who it's from at the end. We say, dear so-and-so, I hope you're doing okay. How's the family? Hope everyone's well. My family's in good health. 8 out of the 10 of us got COVID, but we're all still here. We're going, so thank you for your prayers and everything. The reason I was asking is because, I ain't get that check yet. So, just checking. Just don't want to pester you, but, it'll be nice if I had it, next Tuesday by 3 p.m. Sincerely, Joe. So that's our letter. That's pretty much the same kind of format. So that was their letter. So why is that important? when you're reading the Bible? Why is that important?
You know right off who it's from, who it's to, and sometimes even the purpose.
Okay, you know right away who it's from, who it's to. Sometimes it tells you where, either you or they or both are. So there's important information in those little details that make a difference. Why else is this important? And we're gonna sink in and talk about it. And some of it's already up there on the screen. Why is it important that you're thinking that this? Because what I'm trying to get across to you is these are letters. When you're reading it, you're not really considering that fact. You're picking it up and thinking, this is the word of God, which it is. But in this case, it's the word of God in the form of a letter. An actual letter that was sent by an actual person to another actual or a group of actual people who are reading it like a letter. So what's significant about that? Okay, original intent, content, okay, all this, but what's funky about reading a letter? Have any of you guys ever read like letters from Albert Einstein to his wife? Sometimes you read stuff or see that in a newspaper or something. We found in someone's attic, they had a love letter from Albert Einstein to his wife, blah, blah. And then you're reading this letter. What is significant about the fact that it's a letter? It's not written to you. This is really important. It's not written to you. Yeah, but Joey, it's the Bible. The Bible is written for us, but it's not written to us. This is really important. And so the stuff in there, it ain't really about you. You're pouring over it as if God sat down and wrote this to you individually. He didn't. He wrote it to y'all. He wrote it to all of us through people. But in this case, what you're reading, that was written to a specific person that ain't you. So what don't you have since it wasn't written to you? What don't you have? Personal connection. What else? Backstory. You don't have a personal connection. You don't know this person, and you don't have a backstory. You don't have context. You don't have all the background details that they know because they do have a personal connection that they know. Notice, even when Paul's writing to people with whom he does not have a personal connection, what does he do? Well, tell so-and-so and so-and-so that he does know, that they also know, that I said hi. Or, I'm so sorry I couldn't come to you, but that's why I'm sending Epaphroditus. This man's awesome. Y'all know it already. You know Epaphroditus, how awesome he is, how he's labored on your behalf with me. So what he's doing, he's making a connection. He's forging a connection where it might not be that strong. He writes to the letter to Rome, right? He says, I've never been there. I hope to come to you. I've never been to Rome. And the last chapter is a whole bunch of shout-outs of people that he met in Corinth that were from Rome and were scattered because, the Claudius' edict that all the Jews had to get out of Rome. They went back home to Rome. So now Paul, who's never been to Rome, knows a whole slew of people by name and their families and their households because he met them in Corinth. And so he says hi to all those people at the end of the letter. This is on purpose, to build a connection, right? To make that bond with them. So anyway, we don't have the backstory. Letters are situational. They're situational. It depends on the situation. Like the letter to Corinth, right? 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He's writing and he says, oh, man, okay, you know that guy I was talking about? I'm so glad that he repented. Let him back in now. Well, who's he talking about? And what did he do? And what did he have to repent? Now, what do we do? Oh, well, he talked about some other guy that needed to repent. It must be that guy. Why? Why must it be that guy? Because that's all we have. That could be any guy. We don't know. We don't know what this is. All we know is whatever he's telling us there. And so this is important. So when we're trying to reconstruct and figure out what happened, don't get too crazy with it. Again, just like with the gospel, focus in. What's the point? What's he trying to say? What's the situation? What can I understand about it? But don't try and understand every detail because we don't have it. It's not given to you. Just understand what we have, and the rest, good guess as anyone. Letters were meant to be read out loud. In Colossians, he actually tells them to read these letters in the churches in Hierapolis and in Laodicea. There are sister churches nearby in the same region. So that'll be like, if I sent you a letter and said, okay, make sure y'all, read that in Greenville and Charleston now, it's similar. That's what he was doing in Colossians. And so these letters circulated among the churches. And from that, we see that Paul was writing them on purpose to be circulated. He knew that they'd be circulated that way, but some of them were not. What's a good example of a letter of Paul's that was not meant for every single church in the world? Philemon. That wasn't meant for every single church. That was meant for Philemon, the man. But why did he write a public letter to the whole church about this one guy? Because that was on purpose. He's trying to persuade him to release his slave. So he made it public, right? And then, well, you have fun with that one. Okay, so letters also back in the first century served as, and they still do, even now, they serve as an authoritative substitute for personal presence. What does all that mean? Fancy language. That just means that I couldn't be there, so I wrote you a letter. And legally, that's the case. That letter I talked about earlier, right? In court, if I ended up suing a guy, which I wouldn't because I'm a Christian, but if I weren't a Christian and I sued him, then I could then say, look, I tried to contact him in writing and he still did not pay me. And that legally has weight behind it, right? As opposed to, he knew. He knew he owed me the money. I didn't want to say nothing, but he just ought to. That's not as good legally. So letter is a substitute for personal presence. And Paul states that several times in his letters. He says, I could not come to you, and so I'm writing to you instead. As a matter of fact, at the Corinthians, he goes, I'm writing to you now, but when I come, then you'll really see. Okay, when I'm there face to face, you don't want that to happen. Y'all best repent before I get there. So I'm a real technical person, so implications of letterosity. It's not the author's final words or thoughts, right? What is it? When you write a letter, it's, oh, no, look, I know what you think, because 12 years ago, you wrote me a letter and you said, so I know that what you think. It's a letter. That's not what you think for all time and permanently and fixed and it will never change. It's your thoughts at that time when you wrote it, and you might change your mind. Okay? Now, how does this apply to the Bible? It's just that as someone like even Paul is writing, he's growing. His thoughts are developing. He's not changing doctrine, but he's changing how he thinks about it. And you can see sometimes where that's happening. He might have thought something was easy when he was younger, and then it gets harder when he's older. And so when he's writing to Timothy, it's a whole different story than when he was, when you see him running around in Acts. He had time to reflect and to think about his attitudes and his feelings. And so in Acts, he has to part ways with Barnabas because Barnabas don't want to leave Mark behind. But in the letters, I have no one like Mark. He's like a son to me. What happened? Time. So that's all I'm talking about. I'm not talking about crazy doctrine changes or anything like that. I'm just talking about things like that. It's part of a conversation, and we only have one part. So 1 Corinthians, he says, now, about that question you asked, but he doesn't tell us what it was. They know what it was, but we don't. So we have to guess from his answer. I think they might have been asking it, but we don't know. Or he says, now, Chloe sent me a report about you guys. Y'all know what it said. So, and then he starts talking, but we y'all don't know what it said. We didn't read the report. We didn't get that report. We weren't privy to that report. So this is important to keep in mind when you're reading letters, is that sometimes we're only seeing one side of a conversation, and so it makes it harder to understand and to think about. And we have to make guesses like that. It assumes prior relationships and knowledge. It assumes a shared cultural background. So he might say some things that don't make much sense to us, but would make perfect sense to someone back then just because it's the same, culture. So I extended the right hand of fellowship. We translate that into a handshake. It was actually a kiss, right? But we don't kiss, but some of us do. In some countries you do, right? That's a greeting. Greet one another with a holy kiss. We don't do that. Wait, I thought it was a pattern. I thought we were supposed to be doing. How come we don't do that? Well, what happened to that? Wait a second. So, oh my gosh, we're not actually, restoration. No, but it's a cultural thing. It's like greet one another as close intimates, as close friends or as family, greet one another. Whatever that translates to in your own culture. Does that make sense? But the principle is show affection to one another. It's okay to show affection to one another. That's the principle. All right. Written for a reason, we talked about that. It's brief, unlike me, and it's standard, well-known structure. So that's a letter, and that's the format, which we already talked about. It's got an introduction, the authors, the recipients, so just kind of a nice greeting or blessing, positive thing. A little prayer introduction, then a body, and then a conclusion. And the conclusion is also like usually a prayer or something nice, or I'll be with you soon. I hope to see you soon. Things like that. It's, again, pretty similar to our modern letters. So keep these things in mind when you're reading the letters, that they're letters. Okay, can't mean now what it didn't mean then. So, him writing some letter to someone is not talking about whether or not you should watch a TV show. Now, what he said to that person might indicate whether or not you should watch a TV show. So if he wrote to them and said, keep your mind pure from impure thoughts and whatever's good and noble and holy, think about such things. Well, yeah, those principles apply. Maybe I should think before I watch that TV show. That makes sense. See how that works? Because that still made sense back then to the person that he was writing to. Read the whole letter. Even if you just want to focus on one or two verses, read the whole letter. Few reasons. One, it's a letter. You can do it. You can sit there and read it in one sitting. Even Romans, you can sit there and read it in one sitting. Okay? It's brief enough that you can do that. Why? Why do you need to do that? Yeah, get the big picture, the context. You have to do that to understand any part. You have to understand the whole. Okay, I can't. You can't do that with anything at all. With anything, right? I can't say. He said no, and that was the end of the story. What are you talking about? Okay, well, it's no different than if you go, it says, and then you say one verse, that doesn't mean much because you're taking it out of context. And it probably doesn't mean whatever you're saying it means or how you're using it. Again, because it doesn't have the context. So try and build a mental picture of the situation in the context of the letter. Read entire paragraphs when you're reading. Read it carefully, slowly. Pay attention to, how the words are flowing and everything. But mainly, keep in mind it's a letter. Read it that way, and you'll do better understanding it. Same thing, just like with the Gospels. What did it mean to the original readers? What are some of the differences between them and us? What are some of the principles, practical, theological, that might be in the letter? How does our understanding of what we think it might mean fit in with the rest of the Bible? And then how does it apply now in the same ways that it applied then? Okay? Now, you can't always do that, right? So, for example, how does Philemon apply to you? Well, hopefully none of you are slave owners. Okay? So then what am I supposed to get from it? Well, what are you supposed to get from it? Paul goes into great detail about why Philemon should release Onesimus. Well, what he's saying applies to all Christians of all times, anywhere. He's talking about fundamental Christian relationships when he talks about that, right? How Paul did it applies to anyone everywhere. How he actually addressed the problem, solved the problem, how he treated that issue applies to all of us. We can get something from that, right? How did Paul do that? And so if I'm coming up and I gotta, and they say to me, hey, bro, that guy in your Bible talk, I mean, his shorts are too short in the summer. You got to tell him that his shorts are too short. He can't dress like that. Like, what? I mean, like, you know, they're like up to here, and all the sisters are complaining and everything. It's like, you got to talk to them. Well, you can learn from Philemon how to have a difficult conversation with someone and how to help persuade them without them getting upset and angry, because that's what Paul does. Does that make sense? But what I'm telling you, what I'm talking about, that application, that is what Paul was dealing. That's not strange. That's not weird. That was what Paul was doing back then. Those relationships that he were talking about, like I said, applies to all Christians' relationships of anyone in any culture in any time. They're universal. But that's not the same as, you know, you're reading, see, in 2 Corinthians, it talks about that's why some of them were, 1 Corinthians, it talks about that's why some of them were, baptizing for the dead. So, bro, how come we ain't baptizing for the dead? It says it in there. How come we're not? Well, that's where you have to read the whole thing. You have to understand his argument, how he's using it, why he said it. And it's a letter. We don't know what that meant. We don't know what they're doing. All we know is that's something they were doing, and Paul was making use of it. It never came up anywhere else after that. No other church ever did that until more recent times. Ever did that. In the 2nd century, they were scratching their heads going, what the heck did that mean? Why was that there? What was that talking about? They didn't know. And Greek was their native language. So don't make big, giant principles and decisions on very little to no information. Okay, lastly, apocalyptic, reading apocalyptic literature. So apocalyptic is cosmic. It's talking about the whole universe. It's usually dualistic, so it's good versus evil, and it's plain old good versus evil. It's us against them, they bad, we good. And it's usually, the government. It's the evil government and us, the persecuted ones, the small minority getting persecuted by the evil government. And that's how all apocalyptic is. That's the genre. It's written that way. And it's usually, not always, but usually focused on a time far in the future or the end of all time itself, the end of existence or human history. Oops. Sorry, that was just about Revelation. It's usually presented in the form of a vision or a dream or some sort of supernatural journey, being taken. It's highly symbolic and the imagery is striking. Then I saw a 10-headed dragon with the feet of a leopard. It's like, well, you're not going to forget that. So striking imagery, highly symbolic, and then it shows that a suffering minority will be vindicated in the end. Okay, that we win. Well, no, not y'all. Just we in general, thousands of years from now. But hopefully you'll be encouraged by that. No, it's meant to encourage people in the present. So this is meant for you to keep in mind. The point is, of religious apocalypse, the point is God's in control. He's got it covered. We'll be okay. We will be okay. No matter what happens to us, our people will be okay because we're God's people. That's the overall message. So now turning to the New Testament apocalyptic. By the way, Revelation is not the only example. Can someone give me another example of New Testament apocalyptic? What? Oh, Jude has some, yes. Okay, someone said Matthew. What in Matthew? 24. We're talking about what? Destruction of Jerusalem. So that's an example, too, of New Testament apocalyptic. And prophecy. Okay, so so Revelation is carefully structured and has, these sets of fantastic imagery picturing judgment and triumph. It uses lots of stock images from Old Testament. So, you see, if you read Daniel or Ezekiel or parts of Isaiah, these will be very familiar to you. If you read Daniel, you'll see exactly, these same kinds of, then I saw a 10-headed dragon with, feet like clay and leopard's paws and swords coming out of mouths in Isaiah, all this, in Jeremiah. So these are standard images. The moon turns to blood, the sky melted from the, fell out of the sky and melted, the seas dried up. That's just standard prophetic apocalyptic language. And what are you supposed to get out of that? What are you supposed to feel? Bad emotion. It ain't gonna be good. I don't know. I don't want to be there. It ain't gonna be good. That's scary. And you're supposed to be scared. That's what it is. It's dire. This is dire because they're talking about judgment. They say when God is judging, it's gonna be serious, and that's what you're supposed to feel. This is serious. This is scary. This is real. You're like 10-headed dragon is supposed to be real. Yes, that's what you're supposed to feel. The Revelation contains multiple. It's a mixed genre book, so it's a letter. It contains letters, but it itself is also a letter. How do you know it's a letter? Well, it says it. It says it, but also it has the form of a letter. John writing to the 7 churches. I was on Patmos and this happened, blah, 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 and it goes on at the end, it ends. Come, Jesus, real quick, please, hurry up. So this is, and these things are happening soon, that's what it says at the beginning, so it's written like a letter. But it's also prophecy. It calls itself prophecy. A curse on those who, add or subtract from this prophecy. It says it calls itself a prophecy and a letter. It's got oracles like prophecy does. It's also an apocalypse, which we'll talk more about what the standard apocalypse is, but it's cosmic in scope. It's got the striking imagery, and it's got the visions and the dreams and all this. It's sealed up and then revealed at a later time. So it's that as well. So it's all these all at the same time. So that's what I said at the bottom. The book of Revelation is a Christian prophecy cast in apocalyptic style and imagery and finally published in a letter form. So some of the themes. God is more powerful than the Roman Empire. That's really the main thing to keep in mind. God is more powerful than the Roman Empire. I know you guys, it was written to churches in Asia Minor, and they were experiencing persecution from the Roman Empire. By the way, it is a myth that ancient Christians were constantly persecuted everywhere, and they had to meet underground, and they had to meet in homes because they were first being persecuted. At various times, in specific places, Christians were being persecuted. And at a few times, Christianity was being persecuted generally, but a lot of times it was just like, I don't really want to work with you because you're a Christian, or I want to live next to you because you're Christian, and not, chop off their head. That happened in short periods of time in very specific places. One of the areas where that happened frequently, as in more than once, was Asia Minor. So these churches, they had experienced repeated persecution from the Roman Empire, and this was the let's kill them kind. So that's who he's writing to. And it's written to encourage them. God is going to judge Rome for all the stuff they did, all the bad stuff they did. They'll get judged. Don't worry. They'll get what's coming to them. You will be vindicated, even should you die. Okay? At the end of Revelation, who are those who are blessed to participate in the first resurrection and reign for 1,000 years with Christ on earth? Who are they? Anyone remember? You can look it up. Got a Bible. Okay? It's those who died it's the martyrs. It's not all Christians. It's the Christians who were killed during all those bad events earlier in the chapters. By the way, if you have some people telling you, there's all kinds of stuff and teachings about Revelation, and most of it is wrong. But that's one of the things. Well, so don't worry, either you'll be raptured and taken away, and you won't have to suffer through That's not what the book says. These things are happening to Christians. A lot of those bad things are happening to Christians that are in there. So you're not going to be disappearing before all this happens. So it's persecuted and suffering Christians. They're resisting worldly political forces and powers, Rome, unbelievers, just sinfulness of the world. And they persevere until the end, and they are rewarded. So the basic overall message is God is in control. God wins. God will win, and you, along with God, will win no matter what happens to you in this life. And the other message is to live according to the truth, even though most of the people around you are not. And that's an important message. That's why the Christians are going through all that bad stuff and suffering. Why? Because they are living righteously, because they are obedient to God. They are being, that's why they're being persecuted. And that's what was going on in the audience that he was writing to. Basically, keep in mind that a lot of it is symbolic. It's not literal. So don't look for fire-breathing, locusts and things like that. These are symbols. But Joey, how do you know they're symbols? He tells you that they are. Well, but I don't know what that symbol meant. He usually tells you what they mean. Then I saw, the 7 lampstands that stood before the throne with 7 eyes around them on the 7 censers of incense and everything. These are the messengers of the churches, and these are the churches themselves, and these are the members of he tells you that. So you don't have to be trying to figure out what he's talking about, okay? Then I saw the rider on the horse whose belt wasn't his name. He tells you it's Jesus. He tells you. Then I saw a great people. He tells you who these people are. So, a lot of those things he explains in there. And look for recurring things. We don't understand all the numerology, but it's there. There's lots of stuff. But the main way to begin to understand Revelation is to familiarize yourself with the Old Testament apocalyptic, like Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah. And Book of Revelation quotes from, alludes to, points to those, uses that material, and reuses that material a lot. So the more you read that, the better you'll understand Revelation. So how does that apply to us now? What are we supposed to do with that? What are we supposed to do with a book like Revelation? Wow, it got real quiet. It's still an encouragement. Are Christians still being persecuted anywhere in the world? Yeah, a lot of places in the world, including by death. So it's still an encouragement. Well, what about here? Nobody's killing me here for it. It's still an encouragement. It's still encouraging to know that God wins in the end. It's still encouraging to know that they ain't going to get away with everything. It's still encouraging to know that all the kings and rulers and governments of the world will be personally held accountable for what they did. That's what it says in Revelation. That's true that's encouraging in all times and all places, because you know why. So, and then the last point about this is it can't, and I've been saying this about each one of these, it can't mean now what it didn't mean then. It can't mean now what it didn't mean then. Now, we can be encouraged by what was meant for them to encourage them during persecution, but the text is not talking about Trump and Obama and it's not talking about what's his face over in Putin. It's not talking about that. Why not? That would have not helped them at all. That would have been meaningless. It would not have helped them in the slightest. But them, whoever's talking about, if it's Nero or one of them people, that still helps us, and we don't need to know who it is. We don't need to know who it is. Faceless, oppressive, corrupt government official works in any time and country. So that's basically, and that message is still a positive message of encouragement. Now, yes, you can go deeper and you can figure out all the details of what it might have meant and all that, but you don't need to know all that to get the meat out of the book. Okay, we don't have time for any questions, but thank you. Sorry I went long, and sorry I kind of went off, but hopefully that helps.